This podcast contains adult themes and graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
I'm Renee, and welcome to Season 1 of Beyond Contempt, the podcast where the surreal meets the real. Just a quick note before we start the show. I'm generally more interested in cases that are not well known or haven't been covered by some of the larger true crime podcasts. I made an exception for this episode because the topic is interesting, and it's important to remind ourselves that the internet can occasionally be a dangerous place. Is your Tinder date who they say they are? Who is your child interacting with on social media? Am I safe buying a used TV from Facebook Marketplace? Today, we are going to consider the question, is that job on Craigslist too good to be true? You're listening to Episode 3, Richard Beasley. "56-year-old Ralph Geiger was out of work. He had been successful earlier in his life. Ralph moved to California in the 70s and had helped his dad run an antique shop. He returned to Akron, Ohio in the late 90s and started his own handyman business. Ralph remodeled homes and sometimes hired workers to help. His services were always in demand. Ralph was kind and often lowered his prices for people who were financially struggling. When the housing market and economy crashed, so did his business. People did not have money to fix up their houses, and his services were not needed anymore. By 2010, he could no longer pay his rent. They evicted him from his duplex, and he ended up in a homeless shelter in February 2011. Ralph turned down offers to live with his friends because he did not want to impose on them. He would sometimes tell his friends that he was divorced and had daughters. This wasn't actually true, because Geiger was a lifelong bachelor. He had met 26-year-old Summer Rowley when he had hired her to clean his house. The two formed a platonic friendship. Summer had viewed him as a father figure and a man who would offer you the shirt off his back. He treated her like she was his daughter. That summer, Geiger was using the computer at the public library to search for jobs. In July, he told Summer that he had found a great job where he would watch over a large cattle ranch and perform general maintenance around the property. The nearest neighbor was a mile away, and the location was remote, so cell phones would likely have no service. The ad continued, "Prefer a middle-aged man, divorced or single with no strong family connections. Have a life you could easily walk away from. This is a permanent job. If picked, you would need to start quickly." They provided a 2-bedroom trailer and a $300 per week salary. Ralph wanted desperately to be back on his feet again. Summer last spoke with Ralph on August 8, 2011, a day or two before he started his new job. She was excited for her friend to get back on his feet again. But several weeks went by, and she had not heard from him. All her calls were going straight to voicemail. Within a few days, someone other than Ralph answered the phone. The phone company must have reissued his number to another customer. Despite being worried, Summer never contacted the police since she wasn't sure if he was missing. Geiger had disappeared in the past, but he had always shown up at some point. Had anyone done a wellness check on Ralph Geiger, they would have found him, but not working on a cattle ranch. The person who had Ralph Geiger's identity did not look very much like Ralph anymore. 51-year-old David Pauly was from Virginia and was living with his brother Richard in a spare bedroom. For nearly 20 years, David had worked at a building material distribution center where he managed the warehouse and drove a truck. He had married his high school sweetheart and had adopted her son from an earlier marriage. David became frustrated with his warehouse job and quit in 2003. He had gone through a divorce in 2009, which left him depressed. He struggled to think about starting over in his 50s. With more time on his hands, David enjoyed surfing the web for many things. In October 2011, he came across a Craigslist ad in the Help Wanted section, which interested him. The ad said they needed a general maintenance person to run a 688-acre farm in rural Ohio, $300 per week, and a trailer to live in. David's friend Chris moved to Ohio a few years ago and was doing well. Chris had divorced and started a new life there. David figured he could too. The ad sounded perfect and would solve David's problem of wanting to move out of his brother's house. He responded to the ad and said he was a single man who enjoys being by himself, loves the outdoors, and can fix just about anything. Plus, he owns his own pickup truck and tools. David received a prompt reply stating that he had gotten the job. He was excited to be starting a new life in Noble County, Ohio. Polly's church gave him $300 from its Helping Hands fund so he could rent a U-Haul trailer. David loaded up his truck and trailer with all his worldly possessions, including a shotgun and his NASCAR memorabilia. David's brother said it energized him in a way he had not seen him in a long time. David's twin sister, Deborah Bruce, always kept in close contact with him. She did not like David being alone on some farm for Christmas and wanted him to visit her for the holidays. David told his sister that his new boss was a preacher and he might finally find some peace by moving. He warned her that he would not have cell service once he arrived at the ranch. This would be the last time Deborah would ever speak to her brother again. Polly arrived in West Virginia on October 22, 2011, and was to meet his new employer for breakfast in Marietta, Ohio the next morning. David called his best friend Maul and told him he would talk to him tomorrow and give him the exact location of his new home. He wanted his best friend to visit him the next Saturday. The next day passed, and Maul did not hear from David. He called David's new employer, Jack, to see if he could pass a message on to his friend. Jack said he had just given David a list of chores and would pass along the message when he saw him the next day. Several days passed, and still no word from David. Maul called Jack again. This time, Jack said David had packed all his stuff and left. He had met a guy in town who went to Pennsylvania to work on a drilling rig, and David followed him there. Maul and Polly had been best friends since high school. They kept walkie-talkies on their bedside tables and talked approximately 50 times a day. He thought there was no way his friend David would have left Ohio without telling him. 50-year-old Scott Davis grew up in Ohio, but left his home state to move down south. He had lived in Florida and then South Carolina, where he was a self-employed landscaper. Scott missed his family in Ohio and looked for jobs on the internet so he could get back home. He saw the Craigslist ad that was advertised as the job of a lifetime, a 2-bedroom trailer plus a weekly salary on a cattle ranch. The ad stated, "It will be a real getaway for the right person. You must have a clean record and be trustworthy." Scott emailed the poster about the job on October 9, 2011, and received a response from a man named Jack. He said he needed a handyman who could watch over the place and perform general maintenance tasks. Jack told Scott that there was hunting and fishing there. The farm had game and had a stocked 3-acre pond, and then he would have access to both an ATV and a snowmobile. Scott was all in. He needed to move back to Ohio so he could take care of his mom, who lived outside Akron. Her house was falling apart, and he wanted to help. Scott gave away the rest of the accounts for his landscaping business and put most of the equipment in storage. He packed up all his belongings on November 6th, left his girlfriend in South Carolina, and headed to Ohio to start his new job. He met up with Jack and a young teenage boy at Shoney's in Noble County, Ohio. Jack wanted to know about everything he had brought in his trailer. Scott bragged it was packed full: clothes, tools, stereo equipment, and his Harley. After breakfast, Davis drove his truck and trailer to the Food Center Emporium to sit in the parking lot. They all got into a white Buick LeSabre and left for a tour of the ranch. Jack and Scott sat in the front seat, and the 6'5", 230-pound boy, who Jack had introduced as his nephew, sat in the back. Scott was enjoying the ride and had forgotten just how beautiful Ohio was. He was glad to be back. The road they were taking was paved, but had turned into gravel and then turned into dirt. After 20 minutes of driving, the signal bars on Scott's phone had disappeared, and the trio arrived at a road closure sign. They would have to walk the rest of the way. Scott and Jack exited the vehicle, and the younger man slid into the driver's seat and drove away without saying a word. Davis was feeling uneasy about the situation, but continued on. Jack said he'd left the equipment down the hill by the creek. They would need the equipment to repair the road. Jack and Scott walked into the dark, gloomy woods. As they walked down to the creek, Jack appeared lost and suggested they head back toward the road. They turned around, and Davis was now in the lead, with Jack trailing behind him. Scott heard a click and turned around to see that Jack had a gun pointed at his head. Apparently the gun had jammed. Scott put up his arms to shield his face. He heard the gun again. This time it fired. Scott felt his right elbow shatter. He turned and ran until he tripped and fell to the damp forest ground. He was so high on adrenaline, he did not feel much pain. Blood gushed from his arm. The shots continued as he leapt up and sprinted for his life. He dodged behind trees, ran down an incline, lost his footing, and slid down the slope. Thorns and pickers tore his flesh as his attacker chased him. He didn't think he could run any faster, as his legs were quickly turning into rubber when he ran into a gully. Scott's heart was beating wildly in his chest, and his ears were ringing from the gunshots. His arm bled, and he couldn't stop quivering in fear. Now he felt pain. Scott hid in a cold creek bed for 7 hours to ensure that his attacker left. Once he thought it was safe, Scott walked 3 miles for help. Jeff Shockling was watching Jeopardy in his mother's farmhouse when he heard the doorbell ring. This was strange because out in the country, Jeff was used to people just walking into the house. Jeff's 9-year-old nephew answered the door and yelled out that there was a guy who was shot and bleeding. Jeff thought his nephew was playing a prank, but when he went to the door, he saw a pale stranger holding his arm. The man's shirt sleeve and pants were soaked in blood. An ambulance brought Scott to the hospital, where a sheriff met him to take a statement. The police traveled to the scene of the incident in the woods, but did not stay long. They were not entirely convinced of Scott's story. This man had come for a job on a large cattle ranch and was shot by his employer. The sheriff did not know of any large cattle ranches around there, and mining companies had purchased many of the large parcels of land. Scott kept rambling that a guy who shot him would steal his Harley. The sheriff looked Davis over with his puffy eyes, long hair, and a jean jacket, and figured this was a dope deal gone wrong. The sheriff called around to his informants and couldn't get any information. He found Scott's truck and trailer at the food center, as he had stated in his interview with police. He suspected that Scott Davis might indeed be a victim. Two weeks later, Maul called David Pauly's sister Deborah because he was concerned that he had not heard from his best friend. Deborah sat down with a pen and paper to make a list of places to call to track down David. In Google, she typed the name of the town where the farm was located and found an article that said, "Man says they lured him here for work, then shot." There was no mention of the man's name, but they had hired him to work on a large ranch. On November 11, 2011, the Noble County Sheriff received a call from Deborah Bruce. Her brother David Pauly had been missing for weeks after accepting a rancher job from Craigslist. Police immediately took action, and on the next day, they called in an FBI cybercrime specialist to figure out who had written the Craigslist ad. The police returned to the place where Scott Davis was shot in the arm. They wanted to perform a thorough search of the crime scene. They brought in cadaver dogs. A few hours before dark, they found a patch of soil overlaid with tree branches. After digging for a while, blood began seeping up from the earth, and a socked foot appeared. The police found a man with several gunshot wounds to his head. He had a black leather bracelet with a silver clasp. Deborah described the bracelet perfectly, which confirmed that the man was David Pauly. investigators found a second grave that was empty. Police later learned that it was meant for Scott Davis. As Scott Davis was recovering from his gunshot wound, 47-year-old Timothy Kern was making arrangements to start his new job working on a cattle ranch in Ohio. Tim got divorced in 1997, but remained close to his ex-wife and kids. He needed a job, but did not want to leave his 2 adult sons behind. Tim had been a sound engineer in the 90s. He lost that job and had a hard time finding a new one. He had lived with his parents for a while, but they had kicked him out. People were not sure where Tim slept during that time. Friends thought he maybe stayed in his car. Tim got another job and had been working nights cleaning Speedway parking lots with a Zamboni-style machine, but they downsized him. When Tim couldn't see his sons, he would keep in contact with them via Facebook. On November 10, 2011, Tim made a post to his Facebook wall about receiving a strange job offer to oversee a large farm in Ohio. He would get a 2-bedroom trailer with rent and utilities paid besides a weekly paycheck. But the farm was secluded and there would be no cell service. Tim worried about keeping in contact with his boys. On November 12, Tim said goodbye to his ex-wife and sons, then left for his new opportunity. The next morning, one of Tim's sons received a text from their dad saying he loved them. This is the last time anyone heard from Tim again. Tim's son Nick was worried and called his dad several times and never received a call back. Police had taken Scott's computer and cell phone. They started the search for Jack by using the IP address from the emails he had sent. When they tracked the phone calls and text messages from Jack, they found something that made little sense. The messages from Jack belonged to someone named Brogan Rafferty, a 16-year-old high school student who had no police record. Brogan was born on Christmas Eve in 1995. Brogan's father, Michael, met Brogan's mother, Yvette, when she was working at a bikini bar. She got addicted to cocaine shortly after they got together. Yvette said she was sober when pregnant with her son. When Brogan was born and came home from the hospital, Yvette disappeared into a crack house before he was 3 days old. Mike quickly separated from her. Yvette jumped in and out of Brogan's life. On his 6th birthday, she took him shopping, only to abandon him at a store and went off in search of drugs. When Brogan was 10, he found internet evidence that his mom had traded sex for money. Brogan lived with his father, who had a good job as a machinist, but he worked long hours and was rarely home to take care of his son. From age 5, Brogan would dress himself for school, make his own breakfast, and make it to the bus stop on time. When he returned home from school, the house was often empty. Brogan was a loner much of his school years. At age 8, Brogan wanted to attend church. His dad said he could not take him because of the long shifts. Michael let Brogan go to church with a friend of his, Richard Beasley. Brogan would wear ties and an oversized suit to church, almost as if he was trying to fit into the adult world. Brogan's father met Beasley riding motorcycles. Michael said, "Rich would rather make a crooked nickel than an honest dollar. It was the thing you could say right to his face, and he would laugh about it." Michael thought Richard was lazy, but he was harmless despite his criminal record. He had never seen Richard lose his temper in the 20 years he had known him. Beasley never partied much and spent his free time at church, where he attended Bible study and worked in a soup kitchen. From that point forward, Richard became a staple in Brogan's life and became a mentor to him. They spent many hours together. When Michael was at home and felt that Brogan needed to be disciplined for getting into trouble at school, that might entail slamming him into a wall. Brogan preferred Beasley because he was calm, easygoing, and spiritual, many of the qualities that his father did not possess. Police arrived at Brogan's school and first interviewed his principal, and then moved on to interview Brogan. He was only in his junior year of high school. Brogan denied any involvement in the shooting of Scott Davis or the body of David Pauley that was found in the woods. Later that day, police showed Scott Davis a picture of Brogan Rafferty, and he confirmed that this was the teenager who had accompanied Jack before the shooting. By that evening, on November 16, 2011, police had a warrant and took Brogan into custody. He admitted that Richard Beasley was his mentor and best friend. Based on what the police had learned about Beasley, they issued a warrant for his arrest too. Brogan had a clean police record, but in stark contrast, Beasley's record was substantial. Richard Beasley was born in Akron in 1957 and was raised by his mother, who worked as a school secretary. His biological father left when he was 18 months old. Beasley's stepfather was a trucker who allegedly beat him and was an alcoholic gambler. Richard had a high IQ of 156, but was diagnosed with ADHD. At some point, he had joined the Navy, but that only lasted for 2 years. He went on to trade school because he wanted to be a machinist, but it was unknown if he even finished the program. Richard had worked various jobs and had gone to jail at various times in his life. He was charged with 10 counts of burglary and sentenced to 40 years in prison. He only served 5 years in Texas and was paroled in 1989. During the 90s, Richard married for a short time and divorced. He had one daughter close to Brogan's age. Richard was arrested again in 1998 for a federal weapons charge. He had served 7 years for that crime and was once again paroled. Texas agreed to parole him to Ohio on the condition that he stay with his parents. A dump truck hit Richard in 2006. He suffered head and spinal injuries, took opiates for all the pain, and stopped working full-time jobs. Beasley received a settlement from the accident and bought his own house, even though it violated his parole. It was after that time period that Richard told people he had found God and attended church regularly. People called him Chaplain Rich. Richard would sometimes minister to people at Hope's Cafe in Akron. Streetwalkers would gather for free coffee and Jesus brochures. Richard would always feed them bread from the food bank. In 2009, he told his friends he had founded a halfway house, which was just his house, to help runaways, addicts, and sex workers. He would even go out on the streets at night, pick up people, and bring them back to his house. Richard would appear in court on behalf of parole prisoners to assure the judge that he was helping them get their life in order. He conducted weekly Bible studies in his home. Some people thought he was doing the Lord's work, while others saw him for what he was, a con man. Reverend Fred Lester of the Akron Bible Church was one of those people who called him a fraud. Beasley had volunteered at Reverend Lester's church until he started his halfway house project, and then both parties went their separate ways. Beasley was just swimming in a sea of his own lies. Rich started out being a savior to the women he picked up, but instead of helping them, he became their pimp and advertised their services online. He even drove them to meet their Johns. Many of the women had drug habits, and Richard would buy them drugs to keep them in the house. One of his favorites had been a 17-year-old girl named Savannah, who died from a drug overdose. Brogan knew her as Beasley's girlfriend. However, Richard said he hasn't been able to have sex since the accident because a steel coffee cup was in his lap when it happened. They arrested Richard in December 2010 on drug-related charges, but he quickly posted bond. When Texas learned about the drug charges, they issued a warrant for his arrest. He was picked up again in February in Ohio and charged with additional drug crimes. Richard had signed the extradition papers and agreed to return to Texas to deal with his parole violation. But as time passed, he heard nothing from Texas, so his attorney scheduled a court appearance in Ohio. The judge felt she didn't have many options because Texas did not respond to or pursue the warrant against Beasley. She dropped the Texas charges, reduced Richard's bail, and scheduled a trial date for September for the drug charges. As investigators were building a case against him for all his illegal activities, he bonded out of jail in July. When Texas heard about his release, they reissued another warrant for his arrest. Richard got picked up again on a traffic violation. When he went before the retired judge, who was just temporarily filling in, the judge could not find the reissued warrant from Texas and had to let Beasley go. After this extraordinary stroke of luck, Richard vowed to never return to prison again. He did not show up for his trial in September, and authorities had issued another arrest warrant. Akron police also slapped him with a compelling prostitution charge, in addition to all the drug charges he racked up. When Beasley became a fugitive, he stopped attending church, and so did Brogan. Police were now on the hunt for Richard Beasley. They thought he was likely the killer of David Pauly and knew he shot Scott Davis. When they went to Beasley's halfway house, it appeared he had abandoned it. Police had traced some of the ads to an IP address in Akron. The owner of the house, Joe Bice, answered the door, but said he had never written a Craigslist ad in his entire life. He did not know a Jack or a Richard Beasley either. When officers showed him a picture of Richard, he said that man was someone he knew as Ralph Geiger, who had rented a room from him for $100 a week. This man was a good tenant. He didn't drink, smoke, or swear, and he went to church on Sundays. Ralph had left the landlord with his new cell phone number. Joe called the number and let investigators trace the call. The FBI SWAT team arrested the man that night and verified that person known as Ralph Geiger was Richard Beasley. The police still weren't sure who Ralph Geiger was and assumed it was just an alias. Authorities charged Brogan with murder, attempted murder, robbery, and kidnapping. They charged Beasley with prostitution and the fugitive warrant. The police wanted more time to build a case against Richard. Once the news reported on the murder of David Pauly and the Scott Davis shooting, the phones at the police quarters rang nonstop. They determined over 100 people had applied for the Craigslist rancher job. Beasley's Craigslist alias, Jack, was careful about the applicants he responded to. He wanted a middle-aged man without strong family connections who could walk away from their life. The ad appealed to a certain male fantasy, a cowboy out in the countryside herding cattle, hunting game, fishing, and mending fences. If a female applied, they received no response at all. Jack had interviewed many people for the job, sometimes in person. He would talk about his ministry and would explain that his uncle owned the ranch. Jack's 6 brothers and sisters with kids and grandkids would be there, especially on holiday weekends and during hunting seasons. Jack painted a picture of being a family man living a desirable rural life, which was the opposite of the lonely lives of the men he was interviewing. If the interview went well, Jack would tell the man he was a finalist for the job. But if the applicant did not meet one of Jack's criteria, the interview would immediately end. One man had written on the application that he was raised on a farm, had been a security guard, and was an expert in martial arts. Jack took the application from the man before he even finished filling it out and said, "If you don't get a call, to assume that someone else got the job." A few days after the arrest of Beasley and Rafferty, Timothy Kern's family called police to report him missing after being hired for a Craigslist job. Now police wondered how many bodies they might find on the farm. They had another Craigslist killer on their hands, referring to the medical student, Philip Markoff, who used Craigslist to hook up with women and kill them. Police went back to Beasley's bogus ranch to search the property again. They found another body, but this one had been more decomposed. Timothy Kern had only been missing for 10 days, so police didn't know who this person was. 100 miles away in Akron, Ohio, police found a body in a shallow grave behind the Rolling Acres Mall. The body was in good condition with a cell phone laying next to him. The man had several gunshot wounds in his head. Police suspected, and later confirmed, that this man was Timothy Kern. This was verified quickly because he had his name embossed on his dentures. At first, police thought the motive for the murders was robbery, but the more they looked into it, they realized that none of these men were wealthy and were down on their luck. They wondered if the motive was just murder for murder's sake. Beasley denied any involvement in the murders. Rafferty was talking and told his family that he had not directly witnessed any of the killings, but he dug the graves because Richard had asked him to. On December 1st, the FBI charged Beasley with kidnapping and wire fraud, but still could not charge him with murder. When Beasley arrived for his hearing, he showed up in a wheelchair, and lowered his head to gain sympathy from the court. He pled not guilty to the charges and was not talking to the authorities. Beasley was, however, writing to the Ohio Beacon Journal. In his letter, he had bragged about how he had served the community and cared for the downtrodden. He seemed more upset about being called a con man than a serial killer. Brogan was writing letters too. He sent a letter to his family to apologize and ask for their forgiveness. His parents were heartbroken for his situation and blamed everything on Richard Beasley. On December 3rd, authorities identified a second body on Beasley's fictitious farm as Ralph Geiger. The prosecutor announced that she would seek the death penalty against Richard Beasley and life in prison without parole for Brogan, since he was a minor and not subject to the death penalty. There was a public outcry about Beasley's release on bond back in July. Ohio blamed Texas, and Texas blamed Ohio. Ultimately, Ohio was at fault. When the fill-in judge granted Beasley bail in July, it violated the Interstate Commission rules that any inmate with a warrant from another state cannot be released on bail. All states agree to follow these rules. The judge issued a gag order on the Craigslist killings. Brogan's first attorney had negotiated a plea deal for him to testify against Beasley. In exchange, he would get a life sentence and be eligible for parole in 26 years. His attorney urged him to confess everything he knew. Rafferty told police that Beasley drove Geiger to a spot in the woods and shot him in the head on August 9. Later, David Pauly was buried in the same spot. Brogan told no one about the crimes at the time, but wrote about it in a poem called Midnight Shift that police later found on his computer. Family and friends reported that Brogan grew moody that fall. He even told his mom he would crash his car so he could join his deceased grandmother. This deal fell apart because the attorney did not tell Brogan's parents about the plea agreement. Brogan's second lawyer, John Alexander, now had no plea deal on the table, and the police had Brogan's damaging confession on tape. John fought to have this confession thrown out. He said investigators lied to Brogan and told him that they were investigating Richard Beasley and not him. He was a minor and didn't have an attorney or his parents present for some of the interviews. Investigators had search warrants ready for Brogan's car and home, but did not notify him about this until the end of his interview. The judge allowed Brogan's confession tapes in court. During the trial, the prosecutor emphasized Beasley had not coerced Brogan since he dug the graves, used his Buick LeSabre, and owned the gun that killed one of the victims. The defense attorney countered with Brogan's less-than-perfect upbringing, with an absent mother who was on drugs and a father who worked a lot. He reminded the jury that Brogan was 16 years old when the murders occurred, and Beasley had groomed him for years leading up to the crimes. Beasley ordered Brogan to help with the killings. He had threatened to kill Brogan and his family if he didn't do what was asked of him. John Alexander said Beasley was the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing, and Brogan had absolutely no idea how dark this man was. The prosecutor played Brogan's confession tape from the defunct plea deal. His voice on the tape was calm and chilling, given that it was a young boy talking about assisting in murders. On tape, Brogan had said Beasley wanted a new identity in July because he didn't want to return to prison again. He hung around a homeless shelter to find someone who looked similar to him. Richard met Ralph Geiger, who was at the shelter and was looking for work. Beasley invented the caretaker job and asked Ralph if he wanted the work. It was a similar offer he had used later on Craigslist, except this was the first time he attempted it, and he did it in person. Ralph accepted the offer, and all three men got in Brogan's car and drove out to a secluded area in the woods. Beasley put a gun to Ralph's head and pulled the trigger. It shocked Brogan because he didn't realize that this would happen. He thought Beasley was going to just assume Ralph's identity and nothing more. Beasley ordered Brogan to dig a grave. Both men placed Geiger in the dirt and buried him. Richard assumed his identity and even filled out a job application under Ralph's name. Police found an ID badge with Ralph Geiger's name on it with Richard Beasley's photo. Brogan continued that after the first killing, Richard felt that it would just be easier to kill people and rob them. He watched Brogan like a hawk. He even called him every other day to keep tabs on the boy. Beasley reminded Brogan he knew where his mother and sister lived. Before they met David Pauly, Brogan told his dad he loved him when he left the house. He went to Kmart with Richard to buy shovels. They drove to the spot, and Beasley ordered Rafferty to dig another grave. They met Pauly for breakfast and drove him out to the spot in the woods. Rafferty went to the restroom, and he heard a hard, loud crack. When he returned, Pauly was laying face down. Beasley sold off Pauly's truck and returned the U-Haul. Brogan kept Pauly's shotgun. He claimed it thrilled Beasley that Scott Davis was coming to Ohio. He thought Davis had sold a lucrative landscaping business and would bring a significant amount of money and equipment. Beasley thought he would make approximately $30,000 or $40,000 off Davis. When Scott Davis escaped, Richard got back in the car with Brogan and told him that if he saw Scott, he was to run him over. Scott's escape upset Beasley because he expected to not worry about money through the winter. 1 week later, they picked up Timothy Kern. He had left his valuables behind. He had only brought an old TV, a few bags worth of clothes, and a car that couldn't operate over 30 miles per hour. He had $5 cash on him. They took Tim out to a wooded area behind an abandoned mall, where Brogan and Beasley had dug a grave the night before. They went under the guise that Richard had lost his watch squirrel hunting earlier, and they wanted to look for it. Brogan heard a pop, and 5 shots later, Tim was dead. Brogan thought the reason Beasley killed him was to sell Tim's 1989 Buick to the scrapyard. Richard and Brogan dragged Tim into a hole, and it was only 2 feet deep. Tim didn't even fit in the grave. Richard didn't care. A woman who knew Beasley took the stand. She had received a letter from Richard that contained a treasure map. It led her to a man's wallet and a few computers that Beasley buried in her backyard. Richard said that she could keep the money from the wallet, but she was to destroy everything else. Instead, she had called the police, who examined the identification from the wallet. It was Ralph Geiger's. Police and FBI agents had taken the stand and verified Brogan's statements regarding the theft of Ralph Geiger, David Pauly, and Timothy Kern's possessions. An agent also said that she found a shovel in the back of Rafferty's car, but did not find any blood. Timothy Kern's TV was in the trunk. They found a suitcase full of weapons in Brogan's room, including a sawed-off shotgun, a .22 caliber pistol, 2 knives, another shotgun, and various ammunition. The .22 caliber pistol was a gift from Beasley and was used in one of the shootings. The defense had family, friends, teachers, and also a psychiatrist testify that Brogan had an awful upbringing. When asked, he would never talk about the problems he was having. The psychiatrist also discovered that Beasley performed acts of child abuse on Rafferty, but the judge would not allow the information in court, and the specifics of the abuse were not reported on outside of the courtroom. Brogan also took the stand in his own defense on October 23, 2012. Chaplain Rich would drive the streets of Akron with Brogan to look for his mother. Richard was like the father that Brogan never had, that is, until Richard shot Ralph Geiger in the head. Brogan was too afraid to go to the police because Rich had threatened to kill his family. Brogan even considered suicide, and at one point aimed a gun at his own head. The prosecutor went hard at Brogan, and pointed out that his first several interviews with authorities, he never said he was afraid of Beasley. The state also had their own psychiatrists that contradicted the defense's psychiatrist. They said Brogan did not fear Richard, and that he was a willing participant in the crimes. His motivation was financial gain, and he had never warned the victims, and he had plenty of time to bring the police in. The closing arguments wrapped up, and the jury deliberated for 4 days. They found Brogan Rafferty guilty of 3 counts of deliberate murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On the day that Brogan was to be sentenced, nothing took place in court because his lawyer was trying to negotiate a deal with the state. He was to testify against Beasley in exchange for a lighter sentence. A few days later, the state rescinded the deal for reasons unknown. They sentenced Brogan Rafferty to life in prison with no chance of parole until he served 70 years. This guaranteed that he would die in prison. Richard Beasley's trial began on February 25, 2013. They charged him with a 28-count indictment that included murder, attempted murder, robbery, and kidnapping. Richard's defense attorney said Beasley's health was so bad he could kill no one. Richard took the stand on his own behalf. With Ralph Geiger, Beasley had said that Ralph allowed him to use his identity. Richard said that he was also an informant for the Akron police and gathered intelligence from the motorcycle gang. Beasley said that he and Scott both had connections to this gang. When they drove out to the farm, Beasley said Scott pulled a gun on him because he was the weak link, and this was club retaliation because they found out he was a snitch. The gun misfired. Beasley ran, but Scott caught him, and they had a struggle for the gun. That is when Davis was shot in the struggle. An Akron police officer took the stand and confirmed that Beasley had only been an informant for 4 months and had given them little intel. The motorcycle club rode bikes, drank alcohol, and smoked a little pot. They weren't involved in any activities that would warrant a retaliation murder. The defense brought up the counterpoint that the gun used to kill Timothy Kern was found in Brogan Rafferty's home and only contained Brogan's DNA. That gun had also belonged to David Pauly. The prosecutor stressed that these murders were done for pure profit because Richard Beasley was too lazy to get a job. The jury began their deliberation on March 11, 2013, and by March 12, they had arrived at a verdict. They found Richard Beasley guilty on all counts. The state was seeking the death penalty against Beasley, so this part of the trial almost became another trial all on its own. This time, Beasley did not take the stand and instead just sat in his wheelchair. His mother took the stand and begged for his life. She explained that Richard had a difficult childhood with a father who left when he was young. She said he endured an abusive alcoholic stepfather who raised him even though she was still married to the man going on 50 years. She said he was a mean drunk who could not control his temper and would smash dishes or physically abuse others when he was angry. She added, Richard was molested as a child by neighborhood boys. On the 5th of April, 2013, the jury recommended that Richard Beasley, aka Chaplain Rich, be put to death. During the victim impact statement portion of the trial, a friend of Ralph Geiger said Beasley was a predator who took advantage of good people. Deborah Bruce, David Pauly's sister, said she can't sleep and has nightmares of her brother's last moments. Scott Davis called Beasley a worthless monster. Beasley's statement to the judge was that he had nothing to do with the crimes he was convicted of. The judge took the jury's recommendation and sentenced him to death. Summer Rowley, the friend of Ralph Geiger, spoke to reporters after the trial was over. Ralph was like a father to her, and she would claim his ashes after cremation. She didn't want him buried, since he was already put in the ground once by Beasley. Richard Beasley has tried to appeal his sentence. The most recent appeal was to the U.S. Supreme Court, who just days ago declined to review his case. They have not set his execution date, and he will surely file more legal appeals. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond Contempt. Moving forward, I'll be releasing 2 episodes of the podcast each month. The next episode will be available the week of January 28, and it will be a case that has never been covered in a podcast. My current podcast recommendation is a series called True Crime Bullshit. This is an investigative-style podcast by Josh Hallmark about the crimes of serial killer Israel Keys. It's fascinating, and I think you'll enjoy it. Please visit BeyondContemptPodcast.com for links to the sources and music used in this episode. If you like talking about true crime cases, join the Beyond Contempt Podcast Facebook group. Please consider supporting the show by leaving a positive review in Apple Podcasts. And thanks for listening.